for that. I think it's very interesting to see how science and policy and business all have to act together, and how the business was reluctant to act without some commitment from policymakers, and policymakers were reluctant to act without some commitment from business, and this is all informed by science. So let's begin the panel. Maya D'Souza represents the Business Environment Council, so perhaps we can begin with you, taking the viewpoint of business and get the panel discussion going. Okay?
Okay, thanks, Michael. Well, I've just got a few minutes. I thought what I would do is tell you a little bit about some of the things that we are doing in the Business Environment Council, a little bit more broadly, to show how business is playing a part in this process, as well as why I think you should read this book, and just draw out about 5 points that struck me in particular about the book, which I did manage to read and download from Kindle. So if anybody hasn't managed to read it, you can download it, I found. So just to mention the Business Environment Council to begin with, because I do think it does show what business can do, and business can be an important player. So this was an organisation that was started off about 25 years ago by businesses beginning to sort of realise that though financially they may be doing pretty well, in effect the environmental problems that were beginning to emerge, from poor water quality in the harbour to air pollution, these were problems for business. So business had an interest in addressing them. They weren't things that business could simply ignore or simply leave to the government. And I'd like to come back at the end to this question of business, which Michael raised. So some of, just to make that a bit more tangible, the sort of things that we work on include things like energy efficiency, because there you can see a cost saving as well as some benefit for climate change. Some work at the moment on sustainable consumption, which looks sort of similar, but I don't think as sophisticated as your food project. So maybe we can learn a little bit as to what has been done in LA. Some work with businesses on setting carbon targets, so really being quite ambitious and thinking through what businesses could do to align their strategies with this sort of with keeping the temperature rise to no more than 2 degrees, and also a road transport dialogue platform to work with businesses to reduce their emissions. So a lot of the points that you brought out about businesses being able to play a role, we are trying to work on that. And in effect develop the business case for environmental protection. But just coming to why the book seems so important to me, there are 3 things in particular. One is I think the story that you tell, just the historical story, is very interesting, talking through how things have, the problems that have emerged and the challenges and how they've been dealt with, but also drawing together the social and environmental issues, because environmentalists sometimes are seen as sort of working on something called environment, which somehow is not meant to be connected with people, but in fact, in reality, as you show, it's extremely connected. And also this model that you brought out of science and research, stakeholder engagement and policy development, because I think that is really important, and it made me think about the work that we do in BEC and how important that research, the scientific research is, and how it may be able to inspire even more action by just understanding the figures and understanding the real situation. So that's why I really do think you need to read the book to see how the environmental and social issues are interconnected, and how the common problems, they're very common problems in LA and Hong Kong, have been dealt with. But what struck me in particular was how the same mistakes are made many times over. So LA ended up in this situation with huge amount of land space taken over by freeways and maybe localities that don't really feel a very human scale. But then when Shenzhen was built, it looks as if it sort of almost repeated that. Hong Kong seemed to have a different model, and that was interesting. But then it looked as if the system with public transport, mass public transport, you invested it, and then you lock yourself into a system that works quite well. But I hadn't realised that LA had a train-based system to begin with, but it changed. So we can't be complacent, it seems, either. Understanding the drivers, so land ownership in Hong Kong is slightly different from in LA, which allowed more planning. But another aspect of difference is, it seems, is environmental activism in Hong Kong and LA and China, maybe even more different, China and LA, Hong Kong perhaps in the middle somewhere. So the ability to possibly lock yourself into a good system with investment, but perhaps not do that, and things can change without us perhaps being, if we're not sort of vigilant enough. Making the same mistakes, really important to understand the drivers, so then we can think about how to influence things as players in this whole scheme of things, and understanding the power of the different environmental groups. So those were really interesting themes that I saw in your book. But coming back to a sort of question, a theme for discussion, I'd like to go to the issue of business and the role that business has to play. So as I said, as I gave you some examples of the things that we see business as being able to do in those sort of issues that we're working on. But what I'd be interested in is how different you think the role of business is in different places. Has it been very different in LA from Hong Kong? Quite often I would say in Hong Kong we think business is quite a positive, maybe from where I'm sitting it feels like quite a positive actor in the whole scheme of things. But I noticed the East Yard, the environmental group, sounded as if they were in a battle with business. Is it different, Hong Kong and LA, or does it just perhaps appear different?
Well, I think from an LA perspective, it really does depend on the particular issue and the particular business. Where the example you gave, East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice is a community-based organization that's both in West Long Beach and in the southeast area of the City of Commerce and some of the small working class and immigrant-based communities that follow the path of the trucks coming from the port and the rail lines that are moving the goods. And so they organized in part to deal with the impacts from the goods movement system on their communities. Air quality issues, noise issues, land use issues. And what's interesting from that organization is that you're right, they were very sharp-edged in confronting like the large railroads and some of the groups at the port, some of the trucking companies especially, and then the retailers who, like Walmart, who didn't really want to initially see the changes that finally took place. But in the process of doing that, what's interesting is they, on the one hand, became citizen scientists. They learned both the language and the details of what was causing some of the problems they were experiencing. But they also began to think about what are our alternatives? What kind of businesses can we create in our community that provide an alternative to the idea of these huge rail yards that have not been regulated and the trucks passing through that were coming right into the streets of our neighborhoods. And they began to look at alternative technologies. So they started making alliance with some of the new technology innovators, some of the businesses that were looking at kind of clean diesel or alternatives to diesel in terms of the trucks, and the rail system, And they also started looking at other kinds of businesses that could present a more livable community. And so they did create a stakeholder process around that sense of alternatives. And I think that's a good example of what starts out as a very sharp and edged confrontation could bring about change depending on how the issue gets ultimately to be addressed and who the players are who recognize that it could be in their importance, including the trucking companies and the rail yards and the shipping interests and even the retailers, who were probably the strongest obstacle at first of that maybe it is, as you're saying, in the case of BEC, in their interest to think about that kind of alliance and that kind of change. It's a difficult process. It's not an easy process. Our urban environmental issues are enormously protracted problems that are not resolved through one or another change. But it ultimately becomes a different way of framing and thinking about the issue and who's involved and who has a seat at the table that becomes important. And Hong Kong has a different history than we had in LA, but it's changing in LA.
Yes, I think what I want to add to Bob's point is, other than having the knowledge about alternatives and how it works with the business, and of course, you need the business sector to be open-minded and ready to work alongside with the community and other stakeholders. So that's important. That's one thing. But I would imagine, especially in Hong Kong, and maybe there's been a lot of discussion about if the business wants to do something to improve the environment, what's the government's position and the government's vision in the long term, because that would affect their decision to invest or to change the business model. So without the knowledge about what the government is planning to do in that particular area, it would affect business decision, I would imagine. So that's what I've learned from Hong Kong. The business always want to know what's the government's plan. So we're expecting a policy address in a few weeks' time. So maybe that's the type of documents or blueprints that the business sector is looking forward to, because that's in black and white what the government is planning to do. And with that kind of knowledge, then they can make their business decision, whether they want to go this way or an alternative way, whether to invest or not, or whether they want to do more or less. And I think that's special in Hong Kong. Now, I don't know the situation in LA. Maybe it's more open, it's more transparent. But definitely, the business also have a role to influence government's public policy direction or decision. But in Hong Kong, it's a slightly different process, I would say. So sometimes we're all trying to guess what the government's next move, but sometimes with a lot of despair and disappointment. It's not about, we want them to do what we want. It's about what we want to know. We just want to have the knowledge, because we are so unsure and there's so much uncertainty, and that's really bad for investment.
Do you want to add to that?
Well, just briefly, maybe. On Simon's point, the point about, I suppose, businesses waiting to see what government's going to do, that was, I do take your point that quite often business they want to know what the plan is before they're going to invest. But to some extent, businesses can also try and help shape that long-term plan. So we do try and do that to some extent by putting together policy submissions and having dialogues where we invite the government to speak. And it's not only BEC, I think quite a lot of other organisations do it as well. If we simply wait for government, I think we could end up in a situation where things change very slowly. I know a lot of people say things do change very slowly, but I think we try and get them to change a little bit faster. But I also, the point, Bob, that you made about how the activist groups in effect became citizen scientists became very knowledgeable and then found allies in the business world. I thought that was an interesting sort of model. I'm not sure if I've seen that entirely in Hong Kong, maybe to some extent, but maybe with Civic Exchange, perhaps. Okay.
Well, I don't think it's just Civic Exchange. I think there are local green groups who, for example, they got all these handheld measurement units to go out and measure air quality information and then put it on the web and share. Now, of course, I mean, this is part of the process in which citizen science develop. But of course, a note of caution is, how they interpret the data, the numbers, and what they are making out of the numbers, and then try to imply something has to be done. Now, definitely air quality is poor out there. We all know that. But, sometimes if they are over-exaggerating the problem, then it creates other credibility issues. Now, I'm not saying that, we should stop them from doing that. Actually, we should encourage them to do that, but with a lot of coaching or training in terms of how to use the machine, how to interpret the information, and how to put constructive pressure on government so that they will do more. And it's happening in the US, it's happening in Europe, I think, and it's becoming very inexpensive to DIY one of those machines, and you can just go out and do a lot of measurement. So I think the issue has now moved on. It's not an issue about the technical credibility of the machine. It's more about how you use the information, how you interpret those results, and how to make it into a very constructive use in pushing forward this agenda, so that we can improve our air quality at the street level. So I think it's happening, but maybe not very mature in the sense that we still want to manage that in a way that's become very helpful in the long run for policy making.
One thing that I feel needs some mention. We talked about the three components that are very important: science, policy, and business to come together. But we didn't mention the fourth, which in all of these cases is really crucially important, and that is the role of basically nonprofits, NGOs. I think you all have some represent nonprofit organizations, and they are crucial in bringing together all of these other factors. They're so different. The Business Environment Council, Civic Exchange, and some of these kind of advocacy groups in Los Angeles are really very different. I don't know how to pose a question to you, but it's something like, what's the best way for these organizations to achieve what they can often, as in the case of Fair Winds Charter, for example, what they can often achieve? What would be your recommendations for that?
Well, the illustration that I used of the Food Policy Council is a good one, where you have a notion of that there are different important roles that these different players have in terms of bringing about change, and how they can learn best to collaborate. Let me give an example, and just in terms of the one that Simon started elaborating with, the notion of research that's done through academic institutions, and this idea of advocacy amongst the activists, where they're starting to embrace the idea that they have knowledge and they're putting it forth. Well, how do you make the link between the two? And then where you also bring in some of the other players, the policymakers, the business community. And the story is, and how do you do it at a level of understanding and respecting each role that one could play? In 2001, this relates actually to our LA's experience around the port and goods movement issues. in 2001, some scientists at USC, University of Southern California, organized a conference on air quality and some of the new research that they were undertaking at that point, including around questions of particle matter, for example. And they invited policymakers, they invited business community, and they invited some of the community groups. And at one point, and we tell this story in the book, at one point, one of the activists from the community of Wilmington, which is right near the Port of LA, said, what about the issues that have to do with the ports and the movement of goods? The ships are not the ports themselves are not regulated. So there needs to be a way to understand how regulation can change the dynamic. And the scientists said, "Oh no, they're regulated. What are you talking about?" And the community person stood up and said, "Look, I live here. I know. I looked into this. They're not regulated." Well, he was right. And that began a collaboration that led to a group called the Impact Project, the Trade, Health, Environment Impact Project, that led to this kind of mutual respect for the roles that people can play and the knowledge that people have and the importance of the connections that could take place. I think that's an illustration, not that the community people had the knowledge that no one else had, or that the academic researchers had the capacity to tell the whole story, because there were parts of it that they needed to find out about, and that the policymakers needed to come into play to think about, well, what does it mean to not have some way to regulate at the ports, and the ship owners and the trucking companies to finally say, maybe we can be at the forefront in this global system of greening the port and making that kind of change. And it's not that it all started with this one question at this conference on air quality, but it was an example when you make that connection and respect what each of the parties brings to the table, you can establish a different dynamic.
Well, I think what struck me the most is there's no magic formula when you talk about how to get these community groups engaged with policymakers and academics and the business sector and other stakeholders. I mean, when we started with the fair, we just started by doing some research, and with the results, it took us to the next stage, in which we think about, okay, now what's next? Should we start engaging the business? And then after speaking to the business sector, it kind of gave us confidence that, okay, now we are ready to take the next move and start talking to the government. So I think we just played by the ear at that time. I mean, we didn't plan, for the next 5 years what we are going to do stage by stage, because it's a new process to us, even at that time. But we learned in that process, we try to be open-minded, we try to embrace all the stakeholders, anyone who are related to the issues, we welcome them to the table, and we have a very frank and open discussion about all our concerns, and can we reach a point where we can move forward together. So it's a learning process all the time, and so I think it's really difficult to say that we should just follow this process or trend. Every one will be a new one. That's my take based on the experience.
Yeah, just briefly. Yes, so in terms of all the roles of these different players, I do see some businesses, they just do want to do perhaps just the right thing and feel proud about it. So the point about greening the ports, when we had an event which was about marine emissions, we had somebody from one of the the companies that in effect manages all the docks, just saying that they did decide to reduce the emissions, and it did cost them money, and they were just willing to spend it, because sometimes it's a state of, well, we can't afford it, but it did cost substantially more, but they were willing to pay that cost because it was something to do with their reputation, being proud about being greener. But just coming back to the citizen role, because I know there are a lot of students out here as well, and so I suppose the students will be working for businesses in time, but at the moment, in effect, they do have a potential role as citizen activists. And I mean, I've spent a lot of my working life, really, most of my working life in London, and I just want, there are lots of examples, really good examples from of local groups there, and I wanted to just mention one because I think it shows how citizens can really bring local knowledge as well as expertise. And it was in fact the local cycling campaign, because that group was incredibly good at really understanding bike routes better, I think, than the local authority could ever do it, because they knew the roads well, they cycled in any event, and they could work out what were good routes. But they were also, some of them were sort of IT experts and other experts. They could put this all together on great maps that people could really understand. They could do a bit of the modelling. So they were using their skills from maybe it was university. Quite a lot of people were in fact retired people, seemed to draw on this group of retired people with a lot of expertise. And then they really did feed into local government, and it did lead to change. So there's so many different actors in this process, and drawing on that knowledge that people may have. So I mean, I feel the business community does have a lot of knowledge, and each individual in the business community has a lot of knowledge. But also, even if you're not within that, and you're just within the just an ordinary citizen, there's a lot that can be done, which isn't necessarily protest. It's not negative. It can be very constructive, and I think that is something that perhaps there's still more scope for that in Hong Kong.
Well, okay. Michelle Wong, the real organizer of this event for UST, she has let me know that it's time for audience questions. So let's take some questions. Yes, please.
I'm one of those retired people. We're supposed to be talking about building a network of sustainable cities. And one of the big problems I found is no one has ever bothered to benchmark Hong Kong against other cities with the same problems, etc. I'm just wondering whether you may have some experience, because I think we will find that quite a lot of our problems are the same, and they've been met with different solutions. I'm not saying that any of them are better or worse, but I think it's be a very powerful tool if we are benchmarked. And then we may start to question, why are we doing something differently to Los Angeles? You take food. All our food is grown outside Hong Kong, and everything depends on basically China dealing with the fresh vegetables and fruits that we eat, unless we have some reliance that they're doing the right thing. Most of us will be very ill. And Simon, I've got a specific question to you. Over 10 years ago, when I was chairman of ACE, Civic Exchange and I think BEC was coming to us to talk about this very thing, about bunker fuel, etc., and listed our support. We certainly said, yes, we want to study it more. However, there was one problem then, and that was the river trade. The problem was that it was next to impossible to control these small tugs, etc., what fuel they use, unless China really put the clamps on and made sure that low quality bunker fuel was not available. You mentioned that you dealt with all the big shipping companies. They were all on side. It was the small river trade which was the problem. Now, how did you resolve that?
Maybe I answer your questions about the river trade or the smaller crabs first, and then maybe Bob, you want to tackle the benchmarking issue. Okay. Now, of course, the Fairwinds Charter focuses on the ocean-going vessels. That's the starting point, and I emphasize that again. It's only the starting point. We know, in particular, in the Pearl River Delta region, as well as further up north in the Yangtze River Delta, actually river vessels are dominant, and they are creating a lot of problem. Now, of course, if you compare one river vessel with one ocean-going vessels, you just cannot compare the level of emission from both vessels. But when you aggregate all the river vessels operating in the region, then it is causing serious problem. Now, what's been done in the last 10 years is that in Hong Kong, we have, the government, they have tightened the fuel standards for marine light diesel. And that's the type of fuel that's been used by local craft as well as by river vessels. Now, of course, if I operate a river vessel in this region, I have the choice of either number one, bunker in Hong Kong, or number two, bunker in the mainland. Now, they have to pay, as far as I know, in the last few years, since the last few years, if they bunker in China, they have to pay an added value tax for the fuel. So actually it's cheaper to bunker, that's been told by the operators to me. It's cheaper to bunker in Hong Kong for the marine light diesel, and the quality is much better. So in the last few years, because of this change in terms of the tax added to the fuel, as well as the availability of better marine light diesel in Hong Kong, the problem is kind of resolved in the short term. But of course, then in the long term, if they find ways to source even cheaper, but then worse quality fuel in the mainland, then the same problem will pop up again. But to tackle that, I think the mainland government, they are now paying more attention on marine emissions, not just from the big ships, but also from the river vessels. And I think some credits has to be gone to, it's not just Civic Exchange, it's about those working on this particular area, doing the research and telling the government people that this is actually a problem that needs to be resolved. So they are now paying much more attention, and in terms of regulation, they are already tightening the fuel standards for local vessels, including the river vessels, and they are also exploring into alternative fuels, like using LNG for the river vessels. And in Yangtze River, I think there are a lot of small vessels already converting into LNG-driven vessels. So this is, I think, the trend. We cannot just tackle the problem with just one solution. And there are different things happening right now that would help to resolve that issue in the long run.
The question of comparing, networking, finding benchmarks is really in some ways the basis of our book, and how we're looking at LA, Hong Kong, and some cities in China as well. We decided not to compare one particular city, but look at the range of changes that were taking place in urban China. And as Maya rightfully pointed out, you have different histories, you have different contexts. So it's a complex process of making those kinds of comparisons. On the other hand, you can see where, in fact, lessons can be made from one place that translate to the next. The collaboration for this book began when we invited a speaker from Civic Exchange for a conference in 2010, of people involved in port and goods movement issues. So you can sometimes have these networks from both not informal, like C40 networks, but through issue collaborations, through the networks that are taking place at the community and the regional scale, and through organizational connections. And so 2017, one of the things we're going to be doing is the 10 years after that first conference, we'll be speaking at the next stage of collaboration around these issues. And your own Christine Lowe will be a keynote speaker with Gina McCarthy, who had been Obama's head of EPA, talking about lessons that one could make. On the food issue, just very quickly, we are at a point where you can't separate not just Hong Kong and China in terms of, because Hong Kong imports 95% of its food from elsewhere, that's Hong Kong's problem, and then China has its own problems to deal with. There really needs to be a way to make connections to change those issues on the ground. So in China, as we talk, there will be some gatherings of, there's a consortium of groups around the world that was started in Italy called the Slow Food Movement. And there's going to be a conference in China, the International Conference of Slow Food Advocates. There was one around the food sovereignty networks that have been established. So there is this capacity to exchange information, to make connections, establish formal networks like C40, but also bring knowledge to bear about the changes that could take place in these local places. And whether it's around issues of nutrition, whether it's around food growing, whether it's in the food area, whether it's around how animals are treated, whether it's in terms of agricultural runoff into water bodies, whether it's the air pollution issues or the climate issues associated, there is knowledge that can be imparted of lessons that are taking place, that people are engaged in these issues in places around the world. And I think that's happening. That kind of collaboration is happening. There is a kind of a globalization from below, as well as the connections from above that can bring about changes. So that's my optimistic nature.
I'm not saying Hong Kong government's doing nothing about food and health. They're doing a tremendous amount. But the problem is they're not very transparent.
Well,
and I just hope that our NGOs monitor it more and sort of communicate this to the public in Hong Kong.
Right.
Could I answer that?
Yeah, sure.
Right, because it's related. Yes, Peter, I think we have been actually, as an NGO, I'm chairman of Friends of the Earth Hong Kong, we have been actually using the various information we have internationally to compare Hong Kong with others. We had a conference on Earth Day 2 years ago, looking at the C40 cities and compare what they have done with what Hong Kong has done. But also the most important thing is we have to look at it sector by sector, because they are different. So, for example, food is a different thing. Hong Kong cannot be compared with other countries that grow their food, all right, or cities that have the hinterland to do that. And certainly, Civic Exchange has done a comparison of sort of the Walk 21, right? So that is a separate movement to talk about how we do that. And just a few days ago, there is a fashion summit in Hong Kong, in which we get the international people to come in to talk about how we could turn the whole industry green. And Hong Kong was the leader. All right, so it's not government, it's the businesses, because they are developing it. Although the Hong Kong has the research, RITA, RITA is the Research Institute for Technology and Apparels, and they are working with the industry, H&M, to develop a factory. Very soon, next year, we're going to have a factory which would turn waste into new material for textile. All right, so these are examples of how Hong Kong actually has used the businesses, our strength in that business. That textile and apparel is our strength, was our strength, and it still is, how we could actually turn it green. All right, so the industry internationally has set standards for the whole supply chain, which they call the HIGG, and Hong Kong is going to implement it. That didn't come from the government. It's actually just working with the industry, with the consumers, because there are consumer groups that wanted to change it to greener logistics, right? The film about the true cost actually goes around all the green groups, right? Greenpeace talks about it, we talk about it, and then the people wants it. So the industry, the commerce has to do that. So I think that's a sort of good example of, I hope it will be a successful story for Hong Kong.
Okay, we're getting close to the end, so let's take 3 questions at once.
Mary.
What?
Yeah.
Yes. Another. Okay.
Yeah, I have a question regarding the systemic issues between science, policy, and business. And I want to give you this example, draw on Stephen's example on emission. So if I'm a researcher wanting to work on the emission data, which have been published in 2013, the data is not accessible to me. And it's also not accessible to anyone who wants to continue that research. So I think one of the issues we have in Hong Kong is really that science data across the university is very, very difficult to access because we have no policy on open research data. And also business cannot really access it because it is too bothersome and too expensive. And in addition, another researcher from another university might also not be able to get that knowledge. So I think if we really want to improve the linkages between science on policy making, we need to improve the knowledge sharing and the data sharing. I think it's a very simple, but it's a very, very difficult issue in Hong Kong. Thank you.
Sorry, you go first. Rachel first.
I'm kind of coming back to your slide, Simon. Part of what I'm hearing is what Maya was talking about, how business leading in, how people collaborate and who's experts. And the examples, I think what I'm hearing is where we get champions that are interested in the topic. Now that champion can come from anywhere, especially students looking at things from a different angle. Because my experience with looking at taking the blueprint on waste management in Hong Kong, I forget its proper title, sustainable resource recovery or whatever it was called, when you were able to break down the barriers that are seen between government people, business people, NGOs, form up a group of interested people so they can go under the radar, work privately, you might say, come up with suggestions without worrying about conflicting their siloed approach of whatever their company would like them to say or not, what their government department lets them do, what their university lets them do. You quietly go, and somewhere you need a champion to talk about it. And it's that kind of champion group that I'm wondering what you're finding in your examples of where the leadership might come from and what's unusual in the leadership angle, because they won't be an expert, but they got enough passion to drive their questions, and very quickly 1 or 2 people can find holes in information and say, actually, this is our major gap, this is our major thing we need to work on. And so I'm just interested to see where you find those interesting leaders in the different examples across, with the part bringing up the topic of waste. I was interested, the 6 don't cover waste at all. Well, they all have waste in them.
Okay, can you hold that question? In the interest of making the right trade-off between time and participation, let's take 2 more questions and then go to the panel.
Thanks, Rachel Fleischman, BASF. I've got a very narrow question, which is I'm curious about the invisible hand at the beginning of the process. So Civic Exchange has the authority and the respect and the gravitas to be able to convene groups, but they had to do the research first because you want to bring data to the table. Who paid for the research? When the university at Occidental College brought together the community to look at air pollution in LA, who had funded that? Are there invisible actors we also need to make sure are part of this and in the room?
Okay, is there one more question to throw in? Then
As we know, politicians will always pander to their constituency and businesses will always pander to their value creation, to their bottom line. That's a fact of life. I don't think there is any altruism there, which and expecting that is also wrong. The whole process, therefore, requires some level of stakeholder alignment, and that's where technology plays a bigger role. especially these days, and we see technology has created a lot of disruptive environment for many industries. What role do you think this technology plays in changing this whole process from an incremental approach to a disruptive approach, whereby we are able to align the interests of the industry, the citizens, as well as the government?
Okay, 3 interesting questions. Go ahead.
I'll start with the easiest one for us, which is who funded us? If only there were more. And actually it relates to there was a sort of side comment about transparency. I think who funds you is a critical question, and being transparent is crucial for that. We are funded, actually, we're a sort of an interesting mix of being embedded at the school, but we also operate as if we were an independent NGO. And that's a model that's starting to be picked up at some other universities in the U.S. And that's partly because some of the funding to allow that kind of independent research won't necessarily come through the traditional sources of funding university research. So it's a combination. You still have the National Institute for Environmental Health Science, for example, which funded one of our major projects. You do have the sort of the traditional route, but we had to go to small foundations. We had to go to community-based organizations that were refunding, or foundations that set up community funding boards so that they were much more aligned with what was going on in the nonprofit sector. And then we, of course, had to publish it each year. But for the book, as Simon in the early slide, we had the 2 main foundations were the Luce Foundation in the U.S. and the Wing Foundation here in Hong Kong were very important and had their own particular interest in wanting to see a book like this published, and we hope they're really satisfied. I think they are. So that's one question.
Okay, you're not going to tackle the other 3.
I'll go back to the last one.
Okay. Now, for Civic Exchange, because I no longer work for Civic Exchange, but for the previous projects related to ship emissions, we've got foundations funding, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, some local family foundations. We applied for Environment Conservation Fund for most of the engagement work, so that's government managed funding. And for the big emission inventory study, when I was at USD, that's EPD commission study, so it's government's funding. So I think we try to maintain a diverse, source of income just to maintain that independence, because, I can't remember anyone from the shipping sector actually giving us a lot of money to do the research. But they also chip in kinds and in small amounts for some of the engagement events, like public events, conferences that we organize in the last 10 years on this particular topic. But I think their participation is much more important than the in-kind support and the money, actually. Now, to Marin's question about the champions. For that particular case, the Fair Winds Charter, I think we need both facilitator and champions. So Civic Exchange play a role as the key facilitator, but we also have other partners chipping in as facilitators, because it's not just about the events organized or the research done by Civic Exchange. We work with a lot of collaborators like UST, and they have their own events and the research, and in a sense, they are operating in parallel. And we did not tell them what to do, but we just get the sense that, that's the next piece of work that we need to work together. And they had the expertise, so they did it. And then we focus on something else. So that's the kind of understanding at that time. We work with UST, we work with Hong Kong U Public Health School, we work with Chinese University Public Health School because of the health impact related to ship emissions. And we work with all the other NGOs in Hong Kong by sharing the information, and they also facilitate events and discussions and meetings on their own right. with their own resources. So I think that's the thing that happened behind the scene. But for the champion, it's natural that we've tried to find a champion from the shipping sector, because we know that's the type of person we need to convene within their own, space, to commit all the other shipping lines to join hands and work together. We've got champions within the government. Now, not so much Christine at that time, because Christine joined the government after the Fairwinds Charter. So she was there in the government to make sure that the government will continue to, in conversation with the shipping sector, and to make sure that the regulation will be put in place in the best possible manner. But I think even before Christine joined the government, we've got friends within the government structure, in ABD, in ENB, and Marine Department, very importantly, who were very interested and supportive in the green initiatives that we're trying to promote in Hong Kong. And without the support, we wouldn't have this brilliant example to share at this point. So I think we need a lot of friends in different sectors, even within the public sector, to start with. Sometimes they want to remain invisible, and we all understand why, but they're very helpful. That's my comment. And to Walter, your point about data sharing, I think it's important, but I'm not in a position to say how the academia or university is going to share within their own governance structure. But I'm sure you've got enough colleagues in the room to tell you what should be done.
Well, and there is a movement to create kind of open source data availability that's, I wouldn't say is completely successful, but you're starting to see a real shift. And it's tied to some of the debates about information more generally being open and available. And the big fight in the U.S. is about the sort of a capacity to access information and where and how it becomes available. Let me end with the final point about sometimes change is not going to take place because you have different interests locked into the way they operate, and the sort of, whether from a bottom line perspective of business or from how government operates, they are wedded to a certain way of addressing particular kinds of issues. We conclude the book by talking about a lot of the problems of bringing about change, and where and how you start to see shifts, and how you can characterize change that ultimately can be, we call it structural, not disruptive, but where the change can take root over time. And that, in turn, is linked to how the nature of the problem is identified in the first place, or the issue, or the type of change that needs to take place. And in some of the writings I've done in the past, I call it the discourse battle. It's how ultimately you frame and use the language to describe where and how change should take place. And that's looking at those barriers, but it's really repositioning what it means to say that this change is possible. And that, I think we're engaged in a global war of position, if you will, around how you define the problem. And climate is the foremost example of that. And I'll end with an anecdote that really doesn't have anything to do with the book, but I just love it. You might be following the news, and I told a couple of our friends before the gathering about this, because I think it's such a delicious example, that we're having Irma in Florida, and we had Harvey in Texas, and one of our contrarian commentators, Rush Limbaugh, felt that that Irma was a liberal plot, that people were saying that you had to evacuate because of climate change is making this happen, and it's really not the case. They're bending the information. Don't worry, let's stay put. But yesterday he had to evacuate.
So it worked then.
This is after they opened marijuana, right?
One last comment from Maya. This will be the wrap up.
Yes, and it really, my point related to the question that Barbara had asked about data, which made me think that one of the discourse at the moment, if you want to call it that, in Hong Kong, is around this concept of smart city. And I wondered whether you thought about how you were linking what you've been writing about with smart city, because then you can talk about data as well, because in the smart city context, a lot of people are talking about data. So I'm not sure if you've made those connections between your writing and smart city. Sorry, it wasn't really a comment.
It's a good question. I mean, a lot of the innovations I live in Santa Monica, which is a small city within the Los Angeles region. And when Agenda 21 happened, Santa Monica jumped to the forefront of trying to create a sustainable city plan. And it's done a whole wide range of innovations that have now been picked up, and there are now networks in other small cities as well as the city of Los Angeles. Small cities can be the breakthrough in many instances of what should happen, but this is in the Los Angeles region. And so one of the ways to think about change is by defining it in relation to place. So if you have your small city outside the large urban agglomeration, or you have a small city within it, or you have your neighborhoods within the large city that try and establish, like East Yards Community did in their area. There are lots of opportunities to enter into a change agenda, and small cities clearly have a role.
Okay, thank you all for coming. Sorry, wait a minute. We have one more thing here.
I'm Alexis Lau with HKUST. I just want to comment on the data sharing in academia question, because actually a lot of our work with Simon, with others, we have a database that try to share, but there are two answers to the question. Academic, I think, is much more used to sharing through publications. That I think we still think is the major thing. But definitely, the other thing is even for the shipping data or some of the satellite data that we use a lot, we are in the process of trying to make it part of the database that we open to the public. But one thing that is very important is, I think it was mentioned earlier, well, once you start sharing the data that way, then you need a lot of infrastructure support. Otherwise, it's not useful. So that's I would say, a chicken and egg question. If we have, like in Hong Kong University and in most other universities, it has the same problem. Academics are more in terms of creating new information. The database infrastructure, they are much better supported in national labs. Like in the US, ANCA, NASA, those have big database which they share. In Hong Kong, I think we should think about whether there are infrastructure funds that the government may help to fund this thing. Because from a university point of view, we are not really, actually, we have been challenged multiple times in the university. Why do you maintain a database? Yeah. So those are things that we need to talk about more.
Thank you. Thank you to the speakers.